Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Dennis Prager Show, the Ultimate Issues Hour. Every week at this time, I talk to you about some great issue of life. And I can't believe I have not done this one. I looked at the list, and I have not done this one. It's the ultimate of the ultimate issues. It's ultimate squared. And that is God and suffering, called the problem of theodicy. Not theology, theodicy, D-I-C-Y. And that is reconciling God with all the suffering, the unjust suffering, the evil, and the tragedies of this life in this world. If you ask people who don't believe in God why they don't, or why they're, in other words, agnostics or atheists, that's often the biggest reason. How can I believe in God? All of these terrible things that happen, it seems like a random universe. And I understand that. I absolutely understand that people look at this world and they can say that. My argument against that is not specific to the issue of suffering, but I have two answers, in fact. One, all right, so you look at the suffering and that argues against God. All right, fair enough. Now I want you to look at all the non-suffering and all else that there is and deny that that's evidence for God. You can't have evidence in a courtroom that only argues on one side. There's something intellectually dishonest about that. I have no problem in acknowledging the difficulty of the issue of evil and suffering and reconciling those with a belief in a good God. I, as a believer in God, I fully acknowledge the difficulties raised by the built-in injustices of this world. But I ask those of you who use that as your reason not to believe in God to say, well, but there is another side to this argument. Look at all the good. Look at all that was created. It's a little strange to say X, A, B, C argue against God, but the D through Z don't argue for God. Now, if you want to say, look, there are arguments for and there are arguments against, fine. I respect that. But merely saying, oh, can't believe in God, there's so much injustice built into this world, I can't believe in God. No, that's not an intellectually sound argument. So that's one argument. I said I had two. I have another one, and then we'll talk about the issue itself. The other argument is taken from a rabbi named Milton Steinberg. I always try to quote sources. I think stealing ideas is, in fact, stealing. So often people will say to me, oh, Dennis, I'm going to steal that idea. And I think, yeah, but didn't you know it says thou shalt not steal? I had never understood why people think stealing an idea is okay. So I always try to attribute sources. And there was this rabbi, and I am paraphrasing him. This is a paraphrase, but it's a very, very powerful argument. And at least it's been powerful in my life. And here goes. The believer in God has to account for one thing: the existence of evil and suffering. The atheist has to account for the existence of everything else. I would say to you that in a nutshell, that is the most persuasive answer that I have for the question of God and suffering. It doesn't directly deal with it, but it gives you the larger perspective in which to be able to believe in God. I find that to be a terrific argument. I'll say it one more time. The believer in God has to account for the existence of one thing: evil and suffering. The atheist has to account for the existence of everything else. That's big. It has served in my life at moments of doubt to be a very, very persuasive argument, because I cannot explain everything else without God. I cannot. It all came about on its own. So evil suggests there's a God, but goodness, evil suggests there's no God, but goodness doesn't suggest there is a God. It's an imbalanced argument. Utterly imbalanced. Now, as it happens, there's another argument, too, that those who say, well, there's evil and suffering, so there must not be a God. Remember, if there is no God, there's no issue of evil. The only time evil becomes an issue is if you assume that there is a God. Then it becomes a question, why is there so much evil? But I'll leave that one aside. 1-8 Prager 776. You're all cheating by calling before I finish. You don't even know what I said, and you already called. But look, you have stuff to say. I understand that, and you're chomping at the bit, or whatever that phrase is. Chafing at the bit, chomping at the bit, chafing at the chomp, chomping at the chafe, chiffing at the chof. And I understand that you want to talk to me about it. Now, let me directly talk about the issue itself now for a moment. There is no question but that there are aspects of suffering and unjust suffering, and that's important because there's also just suffering. There are aspects of unjust suffering in this world that seem to challenge the governance of a good God. They do, and I think people like me who believe deeply in God have to acknowledge that. God acknowledges it. There is a book of the Bible that, in fact, deals with this question of God and suffering and unjust suffering. It's the book of Job, J-O-B. And at the end of the book, after suffering horrifically and unjustly, Job asks God questions, but at the end of the book, God asks Job questions. And he said, Job, if you know so much, tell me, where were you when the world was started? Who makes sure that a mother bear takes care of her cubs? Who is the one that makes sure that a mother eagle builds a nest? Who knows what happens after the gates of death? In other words, Job and all humans, you don't know. You can't understand everything. My ways are not your ways, I believe it was Isaiah who put it. I want you to know that I find deep satisfaction, intellectual satisfaction, with those answers. I want to make this clear because this is something that a lot of believers and I differ with regard to. I have not only no problem in saying that I cannot answer fully the existence of so much unjust suffering with a good God's existence. I not only don't have the problem with that, I admit it, and I like the fact that there are religions that don't demand explanations for everything. See, for example, I do not believe when everything happens that somebody says, well, everything is for the good. I don't believe that. There are things that are so horrific that have happened to people. There was no good that came out of it. None. You're walking down an Iraqi street with your family, and you're all blown apart, or brain damaged for the rest of your life, and there's no good that comes out of that. It's sheer, pure evil. Now, I blame evil on people, not on God, but I'm just explaining that I don't buy the argument, well, we really don't have evil, because in the final analysis, everything is for the good. That's not true. I stare evil and suffering in the face, and I am prepared to say this. There are certain things that cannot be explained. Only God knows the answer to. Why a child is born with terrible suffering and pain. Siamese twins. I don't know, whatever. They don't have terrible, they have suffering, but not pain necessarily. I'm just giving that as another example. But I've given you some of the arguments that sustain me, like the Steinberg argument, and I will take your calls. Any challenge on this you want, because I do believe in God, and I do confront the reality of evil. This is the Ultimate Issues Hour on the Dennis Prager Show.